So, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. This is Guy Christian with Goal 16 podcast. Today, our invitee, our guest is from Peru originally, but he is also a professor at the Kyoto University. He's an assistant professor of anti-corruption at the Kyoto University. There at the Kyoto University. So please join me to welcome Mr. Professor Joseph POZSGAI-ALVAREZ. Joseph,
thank you very much.
Are welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice talking to you. I know it's very late there in Kyoto. First of all, I have to I want you I wanted to thank you for accepting to have this conversation.
Of course, my pleasure.
Right. So this conversation today is going to be focused on illicit financial flow with respect to Peru. And we are going to cover illicit financial flow in Peru. We are going to cover anti-corruption in Peru. So let's dig in. Joseph, tell me.
Yes.
I forgot. I have to specifically mention that you wrote a perfect article on that you posted on Stability International Journal of Security and Development. The title of your article that you posted concerning Peru was "The Political Cycle of Fighting Corruption, Peru's Experience with its National Anti-Corruption Commission." This article will be posted below our conversation on the YouTube page and as well on our podcast everywhere, wherever you get your podcast. So let me ask you the obvious question that I always ask every academic. How would you define if I was a guy from a Peruvian, on the street of Lima, and I come to you and say, Professor, how do you define illicit financial flow?
Well, without trying to be technical at all, I would probably start by explaining that illicit financial flow involves two different types of money.
Right.
One is from tax evasion,
which
is possibly the one that most people are familiar with.
Yeah.
But the other one is with money laundering, which is the transfer and hiding of proceeds of crime.
Correct.
Right. Mm-hmm. And in Peru, the types of illicit financial flow that we see more commonly is from illegal mining,
mm-hmm.
Corruption,
mm-hmm.
illegal logging,
mm-hmm.
And traffic of endangered species.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
So that would possibly be my general description to just a regular person in the street.
Right.
The big issue though is that Peru, as a developing country, mostly
mm-hmm.
what we see is monies that are supposed to belong to the state or
mm-hmm.
to the citizens and are just leaving the country, right? We have this connection between developing and developed countries
mm-hmm.
in which these flows are usually unidirectional, right? They leave the developing world and they end up in just a number of tax havens,
mm-hmm.
usually in the developed world or in these industrialized countries,
mm-hmm.
right? So from the perspective of a regular Peruvian, the relationship is very asymmetrical in that sense.
Right.
It is a crime not just because they are the proceeds of crimes, but also because the crimes do not just involve the recirculation of money within
mm-hmm.
society, as can involve, petty bribery, for example, which is mostly considered by economics to be a transfer of,
mm-hmm.
of resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, we're actually losing resources, right?
Right.
So it's kind of a double punishment for society in countries as Peru.
Right. So if I want to ask you what the vulnerabilities of Peru, how would you define the vulnerabilities? I mean, I know you define what what type of illicit financial flows Peru is suffering. Can you differentiate that from other countries? But is there any specific vulnerabilities in terms of investment and banking? How does that affect attractivity?
Sure. So to answer or to understand my answer and any answer that may come afterwards, maybe it's also important to clarify that I'm a researcher of corruption. Right. So in this sense, I engage with discussion in terms of other types of crimes and the other illicit activities that are connected to the aspect of corruption.
Corruption, yeah.
So my answer in this case reflects very much where I come from, not just in terms of my country, but also my research activities.
Yeah.
And I should say that there are a number of vulnerabilities in the country that are many of them share with not just the developing world, but also with the economic, political, and cultural patterns of the region of Latin America.
Right.
Okay. First of all, is the banking, the regulation of the banking system has been very much seen a lot of progress over the last 10 years.
Okay.
In 2011, Peru created its first national plan to fight illicit financial flows.
Okay.
And in the same year, in the same document, they created a specialized commission to kind of supervise the implementation of this plan and these policies. And this commission is a general board of coordination between different agencies of the state. Right? And then in the following years, we updated our money laundering, anti-money laundering laws. Then in 2018, we had a revision of this national plan, which will continue being executed until 2021. So we might consider these steps to be very meaningful and important, especially considering the large amount of money that get implicated in illicit financial flow. Just to give an idea of the size of the problem in Peru.
Right.
Between 2007 and 2019, so in that lapse of 13 years, it's been estimated by the financial intelligence unit of the government that Peru lost around $16 billion.
Wow.
Between illegal mining, drug trafficking, tax evasion, etc., etc.
Right.
And only between May of 2018 and April of 2019, in those 12 months, the country lost $2.5 billion.
Okay.
Okay. So Peru in the last 15 years has been increasing in its economic development. So we're not, let's say, as poor a country as we used to be 20 years ago, let's say. But a lot of this risk has also improved, especially in terms of illegal mining. That's a situation that maybe 5 years ago we would hear in terms of drug trafficking, that the Peruvian government had a lot of experience in the mid-1970s in connection to fighting terrorist groups.
Right.
Those terrorist groups then kind of got converged with the drug dealers. So about the year 2000, we wouldn't talk anymore about terrorist units, but we would be talking about drug cartels operating in the territory, and usually in connection with other cartels in Colombia and Mexico. And this was kind of like the biggest issue in terms of controlling money laundering, right? Until about 2015, at which point a lot of the focus started moving away from drug trafficking and into illegal mining. Not just because of the increase in this activity, but also because of the environmental damage that it caused, right?
Yeah.
so what is important to consider is that a lot of the activities or the expertise that the officials used to have in dealing with drug trafficking are not directly translated to dealing with illegal mining, right? For once, the role of the military and the police is not at all as active with illegal mining as it used to be with fighting terrorism. So this is a big player that is not participating anymore in terms of a national policy. Is formally included in the commission to overview the national plan to fight illicit financial flows, but they are not as active anymore, right? So these are some of the issues that have been happening over the last 10 years. Then another issue that we're starting to see about 3 years ago is something that we also saw in terms of fighting corruption in the first decade of the 21st century, which is we start with a lot of hope and a lot of political investment in it, but with a change of government, this political will or the political drive to solve the problem, or at least to control it, start getting dissipated. And the most clear example of this is the transfer of the commission away from the office of the prime minister, which is in the executive power where usually power resides in real terms, and transferring it to the Ministry of Justice. Okay. So in organizational terms, it makes a lot of sense to have these commissions under the umbrella of the Ministry of Justice. But in terms of real power, let's say, it's an important signal to consider in this pushing these activities away from the sphere of the prime minister.
Okay.
So this is a little concerning. It's too early to say what effect is this going to have with the effectivity of the national plan, of course. But another issue that Peru has been struggling with in terms of fighting different types of crime, in this case, illicit financial flows, but also in terms of corruption, is that we have become very adept, as many developing countries, about developing national policies. Yeah. In Peru, we actually develop at the same time national policies and national plans. Right. And it's not always completely clear what is the difference between the two of them. Right. I mean, they are complementary, but it seems sometimes that it's too much effort to just draft documents. But at the same time, it's never very clear what is the mechanism to supervise the implementation of these activities. So we end up having a number of objectives and indicators that have been growing very quantitative in the last 15 years. So I'm very glad about that. But then we are lacking in terms of reports of implementation that are to have such a significant impact also in the later stages of this effort, right? So usually these activities of supervision come from a specific agency, such as the Controller's Office or the Ombudsman or Congress too. But usually it doesn't come out from the executive branch itself, which is the one that holds these commissions to fight illicit financial flows and corruption to begin with, right? So I don't know if I'm making myself.
No, it does make sense.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. But the question that I was going to ask you is, because in your article, for instance, you do address a couple of concerns and issues, from the creation of this agency to the independence of this agency. Now, the question to you is, are you satisfied with the independence of this institution as it stands now, or no?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
I'm very skeptic in general with these commissions. Not just in Peru, but in general, I can speak of different commissions in Latin America.
Right.
They share a lot of problems.
Yes.
And also, they connect to the vulnerabilities of the country in terms of the political structures and the political dynamics of the country.
Right.
But these problems are also shared with other countries in the region. So I will give examples from Peru, of course, but with the idea that a lot of these cases can also be translated to other countries of the region. Okay.
Okay. So a lot of similarities. Huh?
Right.
Yeah.
So a problem that we have with corruption in general is that in terms of a public policy, anti-corruption does not share the same core in terms of political incentive for the elite in comparison to other public policies. Okay. The common explanation for this is that you're pretty much asking the people that are involved in crime, or that you assume that some of them are involved in crime, right, to police themselves, right? And you expect them to create the tools that will affect themselves in the foreseeable future, right? So, I mean, this was the state of the situation up until the 1990s, right? Then we saw the emergence of international organizations kind of trying to support national governments in their fight against corruption, the idea of becoming partners in this struggle, right? But very much so when there is no interest from the national elites to invest both financial and political resources in fighting corruption. The idea that was that, well, at least we have the UN or the IMDb or some international NGOs to kind of put some pressure on national governments to at least implement the minimum standards to fight corruption, right?
Sure.
This is where the World Bank and Transparency International and USA usually play an important role in Peru and other countries in Latin America, or at least they used to, until the mid 2010, 2005, around that time. Okay. So as there is not enough pressure coming from international actors, national elites only had an incentive to fight corruption when there was a scandal, a political scandal, right?
Oh, okay.
So then we see that the pressure from civil society in terms both of political activism or just a public manifestation or protest would have a big impact, right? And this is actually the story of how the regime of Alberto Fujimori, who was kind of an authoritarian leader in the 1990s in Peru, fell from grace in the mid 2000s because of a huge political scandal that involved his personal advisor and many members of his government in acts of corruption, right? Yeah. So the political stability completely came crashing. Right. And so there was no alternative but to change the government, and the new government that appeared would have to invest a lot of effort in creating an anti-corruption system. Right, okay? Right. And this is actually how Peru started in its anti-corruption crusade in the year 2000 exactly. Okay? Now, because the anti-corruption drive is completely connected to trying to get out from a scandal, okay, reduce public pressure and public demands, right? Increase public satisfaction and public support for the president, then we see that we start generating kind of these anti-corruption cycles, okay? In the first phase, we have a political scandal involving corruption and some members of the elite, which creates pressure from civil society to reform the structures. So this is to create new anti-corruption laws, to create new bodies specialized in fighting corruption, and hopefully start implementing these laws, right? However, drafting a law is a very, let's say, quick process when comparing to the process of implementing them and actually see outcomes, right? Yeah. So in half a year, you can have an anti-corruption plans, but then you may not have actual effects for the next 5 to 10 years. Right. Right. And this is something that has been proven over and over again all over the world, right? Right. However, public attention usually is not that long. And so after half a year or 8 months, after seeing some symbolic efforts to fight corruption, usually from the creation of these anti-corruption commissions and these anti-corruption laws, public pressure diminishes, and then there's no enough incentive for politicians and national authorities to continue with the effort of implementing, which is actually where all the political capital and the financial capital is important, right? And so in Peru, we saw the creation of the first National Anti-Corruption Commission in 2001. In 2003, it lost its president. A new president was not elected. And 2 years later, that commission was transferred to the Ministry of Justice. Right? Again, something that will already foreshadow what we're seeing now with the commission to fight or to control illicit financial flows. And then in 2007, with the change of government, that commission was dissolved with the idea that a new, stronger commission would be created. That commission indeed was created, was much more powerful on paper. It had investigatory and prosecutorial powers. And its immense amount of powers on paper was only matched by the huge failure of this agency, because it only lasted 9 months before it was dissolved again by the same government that created it.
Wow. So why did they do that?
It was a complete failure, not for lack of human resources, let's say. They didn't have a lot of people involved, but they had very professional people, let's say, very important crusaders in the fight against corruption that have proven themselves in the aftermath of the Fujimori regime. So they had a lot of experience, but the budget that they had approved was already not enough for them to conduct their work appropriately. And then the disbursement of this budget was very slow. So for the first 3 to 4 months, a lot of these professionals were not being paid, for example. They were not specific offices being assigned to them. So they didn't have enough infrastructure. Resources, exactly. But still, if they could, let's say, they understood that they could bring popular support for their crusade, they could start getting these resources from the national government. So they started pushing in terms of investigation. But during this process, they started also clashing with some important figures in government that had other kind of interests, let's say. Right? So these two situations combined to make the participation of many of these professionals unsustainable. So they had to leave the agency. New people were not hired. Budget was never disbursed. So after 8 to 9 months, there was almost no activity going on in this agency, as people were already focusing on something else. I don't remember at this moment, but maybe we have an earthquake around that time. So this is something. I mean, this is what smoke screen is called, right? So you just wait the perfect time to make these drastic changes for the worse. Something that I called an institutional devolution. In terms of just bringing back all this effort that you had been pushing for in the previous years, where people are more focused or interested in some other news or events happening, right? So this agency got dissolved. A lot of its activities were distributed to agencies that already existed, such as the Comptroller's Office. But in this case, also to a small unit in the Office of the Prime Minister that dealt with preventive anti-corruption policies. So ethics, transparency, access to information, and public overseeing.
So, Joseph, let me just, I can let you. I know you're very passionate about this subject, but let me say this. I was fascinated by, how Peru, because this is the introduction actually to a very important part of our conversation, which has to do with the biggest scandal of the 21st century in most, in 3 or 4 or 5 Latin American economies. And but this specific scandal about Lava Jato, which is a Brazilian money laundering probe that expanded into Latin American largest anti-corruption, anti-graft investigation.
Sure.
I understand that 3 Peruvian presidents were under investigation or were arrested. I'm not sure, but I want you to elaborate a little bit how impactful the investigation, or what were the political ramifications of that scandal concerning the multinational company, Brazilian company, Odebrecht.
Sure. So in terms, so let's divide this impact between structural or organizational impact, then legal impacts, and then criminal prosecution. So every single former Peruvian president that is alive right now is either in prison or in house arrest.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
We lost a former Peruvian president last year when he committed suicide.
Yeah, you mean Mr. former Alan Garcia?
Alan Garcia, that's correct.
Right. Okay.
He was also undergoing criminal investigation, right? Let's say not all of these former presidents are involved in the Odebrecht case, at least not directly, okay? But all of them are connected to illicit financial flows.
Right.
They are all of their cases revolve around receiving money as campaign donations or consultancy fees for different activities. So in terms of campaign donation, this is the case of Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of former President Alberto Fujimori, who ran for president in 2011 and 2016. And she almost was elected for president in 2016.
Right.
I think the difference was less than 1% of the popular vote. But it was found that both her and former President Ollanta, who was president of Peru from 2011 to 2016, had received monies from Odebrecht in 2011. And they had failed to report the source of this money. Right. So it's important to remember that in Peru, as in many countries, to receive political donations from from foreign actors is against the law.
That's good. In most African countries, I don't know about that. In a lot of countries around the world, developing countries around the world, I don't know, but Peru is good about that. I mean, if there's a law like that in Peru, that's good.
There is, however, a catch. And the catch is that it breaks the law in terms of the electoral law. But the penalties for it are only administrative. Okay. So these are not, there is no criminal liability for receiving this kind of donations, only administrative liability, right? However, the prosecutors in Peru have been working with the hypothesis, right, that they either knew or they were supposed to know that the source of these funds was illicit, right? Because of what we know about Odebrecht now.
That is correct.
Something remarkable about the Peruvian law against money laundering is that it allows for this situation. So you're not just if you're moving illicit funds, it's not just that you know that they were illicit, but you are presumed to should have known that the origins were illicit.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting.
Even if the source of that money has not been already established as a crime, right? So because of this, the prosecutor has a lot of power to push for investigations, for criminal investigations, against not just Ollanta and Keiko Fujimori, but also against former President Kuczynski for some money that he received in 2005, or actually his partner back in the day received for consultancy fees, right? which is of course a slightly separate case. I'm not going to be talking about that, but yeah, in terms of Keiko Fujimori and Ollanta Humala and former President Alan Garcia. So these three individuals were being investigated for this situation, right? Now the problem is that as many developing countries, human resources in public agency in the government are lacking, right?
Okay.
So there's usually too many cases for the amount of people that work for these prosecutorial agencies.
Right.
So what we have are trials that can last hours. I mean, between investigation and trial can take 3 to 5 years to prosecute an individual, right?
Wow.
So because prosecutors benefit from, and public attorneys benefit from the scandal, right? That creates a momentum in terms of public support,
right,
and pushes for this investigation. They're required to show some outcome, right?
Right.
Or some activity happening, and not just saying, well, maybe in 3 or 4 years we will see justice, right?
Right.
So they have been started using, and in my opinion, abusing the idea of preventive imprisonment. Which means that if you can prove to a judge or show enough evidence that, you know, if this person is not committed, is not put in jail right now, they are at risk of flying, going to another country, right? Or start intimidating witnesses, or start destroying evidence.
Okay.
Right? Now, by law, this, I mean, you can keep people in prison for up to 2 to 4 years.
Wow.
Without sentence.
Wow.
Okay. And the reality is that, yeah, a large percent of people right now that are in prison do not have a sentence because of this situation.
Oh.
And in terms of corruption in particular and money laundering, the reality is that a large majority of people involved in these cases end up in prison. The large majority never end up with a sentence. So most of them just stay for 6 to 12 months until the scandal passes. Then the lawyers get the situation resolved. And a lot of people, even in the most obvious cases of corruption, they end up not being sentenced for it. Wow. Even though they may have stayed in prison for up to 2 years.
Up to 2 years, wow.
But in this sense, can we actually say that justice is being served? In my opinion, not at all.
No,
and in reality, it can be easily abused just to generate some sympathy or to just produce some more popular support for the government of the moment.
So, you know, having said that, in your opinion, do you think that the current president has used this mechanism? First of all, what is the relationship between the president or the current government and the agency or the prosecutors prosecuting this or investigating these alleged crimes?
Sure.
I mean, yeah.
So the system that we have in Peru is we have the public procurators, which are the agency attorneys, let's say.
Right.
And they bring cases to the public prosecutor, which is the prosecutor agency is an independent agency. So it's completely separate from the executive or the Congress or the judiciary. It's its own autonomous agency. This does not mean, of course, that they don't receive some political pressure to act in one way or another, especially through the appointment of the president of that agency.
Right.
But in reality, yeah, I mean, they tend to act in an independent way. I cannot say that it is necessarily impartial, because they also, let's say, become a focus of attention for media and people, right? So in some cases, I mean, a few of them have become almost national heroes because of their willingness to prosecute people involved with other breach in Peru. But at the same time, using a lot of this figure of preventive imprisonment sometimes pushing for the tipification of crime that doesn't seem to actually be sustainable in a court of justice.
Right.
However, people, I mean, because corruption is a very emotional thing for everyone.
Right.
Especially in developing countries.
Right.
So normally once the person steps into jail, is for the regular citizens, it's very hard, first of all, to understand that they are not being sentenced, but they are just being preventively sent to prison. And because of this, they just tend to be satisfied with the outcome. They consider this to be an outcome, let's say.
Right.
Start producing this popular support for the actors involved. It be either a justice or an attorney or even the president. But yeah, beyond that, I cannot really say that we have improved much over the last 20 years. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we keep seeing this situation of it seems that investigation is going somewhere. Trials sometimes even start, but at the end of the day, it's really hard to, like, if we start reviewing the important scandals of the last 10 years,
right,
and we start thinking to ourselves, well, how many of them actually got a sentence, and weren't sent to jail for 3, 5, or whatever amount of years. Even for me, it's difficult to say that any important actor in the political sphere was sentenced. We thought that was going to be the situation with the former first lady, the wife of former President Ollanta Humala. But the same happened. I mean, she stayed in prison for about 12 months. Then she was sent back home. The same happened with Keiko Fujimori. Right now, she's in house arrest. The same with former President Kuczynski, but in his case, because of he's already a senior citizen.
Right.
So this had an impact on that. But so we see this to be a recurring situation.
Right. Let me ask you this. According to the Global Corruption Barometer, which is an independent organization, they are evaluating about 65% of the people in Peru that are still thinking that corruption has increased in the previous 12 months. Now, there is also a 30% public average on public service where user paid a bribe in the last in the previous 12 months. Right, this is a 2019 10th edition from Latin America and the Caribbean report. So is that the reflection of what you think is happening right now in the country?
Yes, I can completely say that, at least with the Global Corruption Barometer, is very accurate.
Okay.
I have been able to replicate those results conducting my own surveys in Peru.
Okay.
And yeah, about 30 to 32% declared to have paid a bribe over the previous 12 months.
Okay.
If you ask them, corruption is, I mean, it's not that people tolerate corruption. Again, 30% of them do participate actively in corruption, but it's not that they approve of it. Many of them don't have any other option.
Right.
However, it's interesting to see that depending on the type of corruption that they are facing, their opinion of it will change. If you point to them of corruption in the judiciary, over 90% of people will say that that's completely wrong. They completely disapprove of that situation. But it doesn't appear to be the same percentage if you ask them about corruption in City Hall, for example, or even corruption in their own offices in the private sector.
Right.
People differentiate depending on the type of corruption.
Okay.
Based on a lot of different factors, but also if they consider that to be fair or not.
Right.
And of course, the administration of justice is a very sensible issue. So, and it's not the same as, for example, if we're looking to get a license for a new business, or things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, people in Peru, as in other countries in Latin America, tend to tolerate situations that they feel more affinity towards.
Right.
If they can put themselves in the shoes of the people involved in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of high-level corruption or ground corruption, things in reality have improved, even if people are not always so optimistic. I always say that Latin American people are the least optimistic people that I know. Not just because they don't think that things will improve in the next 12 years, but because even though corruption is diminishing in absolute terms in many cases, they continue seeing themselves in relative terms, right? So if corruption is also diminishing in OECD countries, right, or in other regions at the same pace, because we're still far behind them, we think that nothing has changed. Right? So before we may have seen 10 scandals of corruption affecting members of Congress between 2000 and 2005. Now we don't see those numbers anymore. The type of cases has also changed. Now we see a lot of conflict of interest, trafficking in influence, for example, whereas before we will see more obvious cases of corruption, such as embezzlement, bribery, cronyism, etc., right? However, if you ask a normal person in Peru, they think that nothing has changed. Right? But again, as I mentioned, in absolute terms, it has changed. It's just that it's difficult for these numbers to be translated to perception. And this is one of the biggest issues with the CPI, right? With the corruption perception. Is that it doesn't account for absolute changes. It only reflects relative perception.
Perception, that's correct.
So as long as people just consider themselves to be doing worse than their neighbors, for them nothing will have changed. And this is really really dramatic for anti-corruption researchers such as myself, you know. And this is why I mean, people have been trying to come up with, you know, better approaches to measuring corruption since the CPI started in the mid-1990s. Luckily, we're not fighting so much about how to define corruption anymore. We needed a good definition to be able to start measuring more accurately. Now we have some ideas of how to approach this. Many of my colleagues agree that that involves not just trying to measure corruption, because corruption is an umbrella term. It just is the way that we identify a large number of activities, be them embezzlement, vote buying, bribery, extortion, etc., right? But then the issue is that the Global Corruption Barometer only involves bribery, which is the most obvious case of corruption.
That's correct.
And so a question that nowadays some of my colleagues and I are asking is, well, what happens, you know, when we move on to countries, you know, such as OECD countries that don't have the issue of bribery as pervasive as developing countries, right? But they do have a big issue of other types of corruption.
Of corruption, that is correct. Definitely.
Such as money laundering, of course, in their financial system. Lobbying, unethical lobbying.
Lobbying is a big T.
Correct. So then we have nepotism, cronyism. So a lot of these activities are huge in the developing countries, but they don't tend to be targeted by these international rankings of corruption, right?
Which is unfortunate. In my opinion.
I would say that more than unfortunate is really unfair. Because then we end up only measuring that type of corruption, which is especially pervasive in developing countries.
I mean, if you compare these two kind of corruption in terms of volume of amount of money, you realize that the Western world has more corruption than the European world. You know,
it is very
all our money. This is one of the reasons why most academics, most Western academics or experts that I interact with, refused to admit the idea of illicit financial flow. Remember that the concept came about because developing countries such as Peru and all the rest of the countries in the world wanted development to be financed by different ways other than aid, right?
Right.
So, but the money stolen in Peru, where do they find the money? It's here in New York. It's in Paris,
yeah.
in London, or all these Western countries. That's where the money is located. This is why they don't accept the concept. It's simple as that. It comes down to that. They don't want to admit that, yeah, they are facilitating the flow from Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and so forth and so forth and so forth to be located, right here in New York. Right. So, if I was to ask you in terms of solution to resolve illicit financial flow and corruption in Peru, given the fact that there are some progress, as you clearly stated yourself, that have been made since the agencies were created, what do you think the current government should do as a practical matter to at least change the perception, even though, again, you and I agree on that, the perception issue is a subjective issue because, the analysis is not what it's supposed to be, in our opinion, right? So what would you tell the current government of Peru to do?
Right. Peru is in general following the international standards set by, usually OECD countries, which is not bad at all, of course. I completely approve of it. The problem is that also many OECD countries are not doing enough to control illicit financial flows. Right now, I like very much the model that have been implemented in UK by the Department of International Development.
Right.
They seem to have a much more comprehensive look at what, how to consider an IFF and also how to control it. Just to give one example, in Peru, as in many other countries, banks have the duty to report any suspicious activity happening in their accounts, right? The reality, though, is that that only works if either one, you have a system that is working with some type of algorithm that helps the processing of that information to identify red flags and investigate them quickly to get a response to the bank that generated that report. But if you don't have that, then everything has to be sorted manually.
Right.
And the reality is that we don't have the human resources, right? So we have a system that it looks good in paper, that in reality we don't have the capacity to implement appropriately. And the same situation happens with asset declaration by public officials. These sworn statements are not being overseen realistically. We can take a subsample of them and estimate the percentage of errors that we're getting in the system, but we're not doing enough in that sense.
Right.
So either we're targeting too many people, or we are not investing enough in the proper technological and human resources to actually respond to this challenge. So that is one situation that I would consider just not trying to follow what OECD standards are at a minimum, which has been seems to have been a position of the Peruvian government for some years now, because there is big interest in becoming part of the OECD at some point. So to comply to these requirements is very important, but we tend to just aim for the minimal requirements, right? So this is a situation that I usually criticize some of my Peruvian colleagues, in the sense of, You know, I tend to recommend, well, if you gotta look for ideas, you need to look at the country or the agency that is considered to be doing the most, doing more than required, legally speaking, right? That is the person that should be, you know, putting, that should be your standard, not the minimal requirement, right? That is the difference between thinking in terms of compliance or thinking in terms of integrity. Right. And I see this a lot. I don't think that many agencies are trying to do as much as possible, just trying to do the minimum that is required. Now, in terms of corruption, the situation is a little more delicate because, in general, anti-corruption reforms have not been particularly successful anywhere. Both in developing countries and developed countries.
Tell me about it.
And I mean, maybe I'm skeptical of anti-corruption commissions also because corruption does not seem to have been controlled in richer countries through the implementation of anti-corruption commissions to begin with. The whole idea of an anti-corruption commission started in Hong Kong and Singaporean cases, right? That has not been able to be replicated almost anywhere else. So I will say that most likely, and maybe this is because I tend to think in terms of what academicians could do to support these efforts, is that first of all, we need to have a better or more operational understanding of what corruption is, as we just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So not just to throw the word corruption around. Not even the United Nations Convention Against Corruption tries to define it. But just actually goes through the types of activities that they would consider to be corrupt, right? So that pretty much settled the discussion on the definition of corruption, at least in professional terms. So it's a huge deal. Now, how to move from there to actually start, you know, creating indexes, ranking, measurements, is a whole different deal. And that's why right now, we have Global Integrity, this international anti-corruption NGO, have partnered up with the ACE initiative from the UK government to try to find more actionable ideas on how to deal with corruption. And they are pretty much moved by the idea that we need to stop thinking in terms of nations and in terms of general corruption, but look smaller. Local areas, specific industries, and specific agencies. You know, so instead of trying to implement or develop an anti-bribery policy for the executive branch, we should be looking at anti-bribery compliance in the Ministry of Agriculture, for example. Because of the specialized activities that they engage with and the resources that they may have, right? But this, of course, I mean, requires a complete switching from research in general terms on corruption and just looking at more specific cases. And this is troublesome when we consider that corruption has not been an issue, you know, openly discussed in international spheres for more than 25 years, 30 years tops, right? So this is really a new field of research and professional development. And there's still much that we don't know, that we don't understand. And third, so even if we did have better measurements, we still need to deal with the issue of political will. And I right now very much endorse the idea of Mushtaq Khan. He also works with the GIA's program in terms of, you know, how to convince leaders in places where corruption is pervasive to actually do something about it. Right? And the reality is that it's very hard, you know, if you go to a government that, you know, have been experiencing many corruption scandals involving the presidents or members of his entourage or his ministers, etc., etc. It's very hard to go to him and say, hey, why don't you implement an independent anti-corruption commission that reports directly to an international agency? I mean, that would be almost impossible, right? We saw an experience like that in Guatemala, being kind of successful for 10 years. Honduras tried to replicate it. It lasted only 3 years before being dissolved. It's extremely hard under the best circumstances, okay? So what we need to start doing is to find common interests, even with those members of the elite that we consider that can be benefit from corrupt activities or corrupt structures. So this is not to say that we should just tolerate their activities, but, you know, because even leaders in highly corrupt societies are interested in political stability and some level of economic development, right? So if you identify those areas in which a country can improve their economy or improve other areas of life, such as education, health, security, right? That at the same time does not affect the structure of power and the interest that they may have, you know? So if you start finding these commonalities between the two, the reformers, the anti-corruption reformers, and these, you know, uninterested elites, you can start implementing, you know, small but effective programs at the local level or in specific industries to start having an effect, you know? And the idea is that, you know, once you create a little island of integrity, the situation hopefully starts, you know, getting reproduced by either institutional effort or support from international actors. But the fact is that there's still a lot that we can do without having to tackle every instant of corruption at the same time. And I don't think that the international anti-corruption regime really got this until very recently.
Joseph, it was a wonderful conversation. I know it's late in Kyoto. We are just, it's 10 o'clock here. It must be.
It's 11 p.m. here.
11 p.m. in there. So I cannot thank you that much, you know, and I want to have this conversation again. Hopefully we will do that again. Because as you know, corruption is here to stay.
Yes.
Corruption is not going anywhere. Okay. So anti-corruption too is here to stay.
Right.
And we, from our side of anti-corruption, we are going to do whatever we can, you know, to help our countries and help the world become a better world, right? I know that, for instance, you're very, you know, reluctant, and you say yourself you're skeptic. I was going to ask you for a last word. Do you think Peru is going to reach successfully the 2030 SDG goals? I mean, you know.
Goal 16?
Right.
I would be very much surprised if we do.
Yeah.
This is not to say that we can't.
Right.
But I think that the next couple of years are going to be crucial in terms of electing the right leadership that can get us there. Without committed leadership, there's not enough reformers, you know, and members of civil society willing to do something to actually have a real effect in terms of the 2030 objective.
Yeah.
So I hope for the best, but again, I remain skeptical.
Okay.
I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to
Of course. Yes.
And allow me to congratulate you for this
Thank you.
effort.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That you are holding about goal 16.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.